Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&As. It's Thursday afternoon and I just realized that I should probably do these now because I have a video premiering tomorrow on Friday. I'll be doing a live stream on Saturday, and an interview I just recorded that was a ton of fun, by the way, is going to be going live probably to supporters on Sunday and publicly on Monday. So I didn't want to overlap and have two videos on the same day, so I figured, what the heck, I already have all the equipment out from recording the interview. Might as well just crack open a beer. Fat Tire's all the store down the street had this week that was worth drinking, so got one of these and figured let's see what questions we have. So let's see what we got, and hopefully this was enough time for everybody to get their questions in. I know I usually like to do it Friday morning, so I might have missed one or two, but let's see what we got. Adam Ant said they had a follow-up question about recapping older consoles. They've recapped one or two of theirs, but never had leaking capacitors. How does the difficulty of the recapping increase when one of them does leak? Is it just a matter of cleaning up board corrosion and praying it didn't eat through a trace? And what are some examples you've experienced of recapping gone wrong? So a couple of things. First, the difficulty increases when there's damage done on the board. So as an example, I recapped a Super Nintendo last year or something, and there was some discoloration under the caps to the point where at first I almost thought it was factory flux, which was left on the board, which is super common to find in Super Nintendos, I guess, pun intended. But it doesn't corrode anything. It's just on there. But once I replaced the capacitor, or once I removed the capacitor and I went to clean it, it was a lot harder to clean off than just flux would have been. And I ended up having to use, I have it right here actually, an electronics brush. So it looks like a toothbrush, it works like a toothbrush, but it's a lot harsher than one would be. So it's kind of perfect for electronics. I used this and isopropyl, kind of had to scrub it for a bit, but everything came off to the point where the motherboard looked perfect. Everything was the same color, and the traces looked fine. So if that's what you find, it's a little bit harder, but I wouldn't worry about that at all. I would just clean it off. It's only when you get to stuff where the capacitor juice, or whatever you want to call it, the electrolytic fluid, starts to actually eat away at the board or the traces. And that's when it starts to get really hard, and that's when you might want to contact a pro. And one sign of this, and you could laugh all you want when I say this, but one sign that it's going to be bad is if you crack open a console, especially one of the portable TurboGrafx consoles or PC Engine. If you crack open a console and it smells like fish really bad, just contact a pro, because it's going to be a nightmare. In fact, a bunch of my friends have horror stories of their workshops reeking of fish for a couple of days, because that's just what some of these cap fluid smells like after a while. And lastly, what are some examples you've experienced of recapping gone wrong? I've seen some people use cutters to cut surface mount capacitors off and then use a soldering iron and some tweezers to get the rest of the material off. If you don't know what you're doing, if you don't do that exactly right, you could absolutely rip the traces off the motherboard. Same with people that twist capacitors off. There's a method to do it just right, but it's not one I would recommend because it's just too easy to damage the board. So if you see pros do it, don't just assume that that's a good method. No offense to anybody, just kind of giving my own examples of what have happened to me. So that's one. I would recommend, if you don't have any kind of specialty equipment for removing surface mount caps, you could use tweezers or pliers or I guess even a flathead or something, and lightly put pressure. Don't pull on it, but heat up one side at a time in order to pull one side up, then heat up the other side, and then get it off that way. I've bought some cheap tweezer soldering irons before that were garbage. And a couple of people even recommended to me just get a second Kesker gun and hold one on each side and do it that way. I probably should have done that. In fact, I probably should do that now just to test that method. But removing caps the wrong way, it's definitely something that's gone wrong. One method that seemed to always work fine, though, is when there's some extra space underneath the capacitor on not surface mount, the ones with legs. So you could go in there and easily snip the legs, not the caps, so you're not pulling anything. And then you just use a soldering iron and some tweezers to pull out the legs one at a time. But I've seen people get a little grabby with that and not not let the heat do the work. When you're doing stuff like that, you want to make sure to snip and not pull. And then when you're having the tweezers or your pliers on the legs, you're only there to guide it. You're not pulling. You're letting the heat everything up. And when it turns into molten solder, it'll just slide right out with no pressure. I've seen people tug and rip stuff that way. And of course, the example that I've given a few times of when I used a desoldering gun to first heat up and bend the legs on the bottom of a Sega CD2. In doing that, and very gently, I wasn't like manhandling it and putting pressure, but accidentally let the gun scrape across the bottom. It only happened twice, and both times I ended up scraping traces. So a friend of mine had to end up fixing it. So those are definitely recaps gone wrong that were 100% my fault or the fault of the people doing them when I was working with somebody that accidentally did that. So I would kind of look out for that stuff. Bradley said when a new product is released in retro gaming, they often see people get excited because there's more competition, as that will create more innovation. Yet some of the most innovative projects in retro gaming are because of collaboration, such as the Mr. Project. Given the relatively small size of the retro gaming market, do you think competition or collaboration is more important in driving new and innovative projects? So that's a really good question. I do think that's much better answered in a roundtable format and throughout a full podcast. But I do want to answer the question because it's a good one. I think a short answer, without going into too much detail, is I think because of the small community and because most of us are nerds in some way, some sort of collaboration is more beneficial. And that could be as basic as, hey, usually they make these types of products. I'm about to make one. Are you already working on one? You don't have to give me any details. Yes, you're 90% done. Okay, I won't waste my time. Thank you. I'll move on to the next thing. Like stuff like that. Even basic collaboration like that, I think is super helpful. I do think any open source product is better collaborated. And of course, there's always the scenario in any kind of collaboration of possibly too many cooks in the kitchen. There needs to be a leader. Some people just don't get along, which is fine. We're all humans. Two good people could just not get along for whatever reason. So collaboration isn't always the answer, but as a general answer to your question, I think I would lean more on that. I think in other industries, not retro gaming, you see companies kind of, I don't want to use the word lazy, but kind of get comfortable. So maybe they have a product that's been out for a while that everybody really likes, but they figure everything's going well, so why change it? And then another competitive product comes out and they realize, hey, I can make the same thing cheaper now just by adding, swapping these older parts with new ones that perform identically. And hey, if we're doing a part swap, maybe I could just add this feature in too. People have been asking about that. And as a result, a good product gets cheaper and better because of competition, and even friendly competition, not even nasty marketing or anything like that. So, but I don't see that nearly as much in retro gaming. And it's something that, depending how it's done too, competition could be really great and positive, and two friends could be competitive, and the entire time they could be having fun and enjoying themselves. Just because you use the word competition doesn't necessarily add a negative connotation to it. But I think in the projects that I've worked on, some sort of collaboration, even the simple basic one like I mentioned before, is more beneficial in smaller communities. But once again, this is not a yes or no answer. I don't think you expected one at all, by the way, but this is something that really deserves a lot more elaboration. But that's kind of my very basic off-the-cuff thoughts on the question. Blackguard has an NTSC PlayStation 1 with the X Station installed and wants to know what it would take to have PAL games run with RGB output. So I believe that requires some kind of hardware region mod as well. I think the PS1 Digital has that stuff built in, but you might need to have some other mod done to it. Now, I apologize because I'm not at all an expert in PAL stuff. I barely have any experience with it, both because it's not easy to get in the US and just because a lot of the stuff that I do really only deals with NTSC. So I would definitely double check. I could absolutely be wrong, but I think the X Station itself doesn't care what region the game is, but the hardware of the PlayStation that you're playing still does, because it thinks it's the original PAL or NTSC game. So I would double check, but I think you're going to need some other kind of hardware mod for that. Lucas Persivic wants to know how the Sega Saturn optical drive emulator called the Satiator is pronounced. The last time I talked to Professor Abrasive and asked him, I believe he said it was Satiator, but I also think that he came up with the name as a written wordplay and didn't think about pronunciation until afterwards. At the very least, I don't think he cares, and I really mean that in a positive way. I think it's one of these, call it the Satiator, call it the Satiator, call it whatever you want, as long as you enjoy it, he's happy. I called it Satiator a bunch of times because I kind of thought it fit, but I believe he did say the original intention was wordplay and satiator. So I could be wrong. I could be remembering it wrong, but I'm probably still going to call it both because maybe I'm an awful person for saying this, but sometimes it just makes me giggle when people lose their minds that I mispronounce things that don't matter that they're mispronounced. Sorry. It's a Serial Wow heard an electrical pop during a gaming session the other day when gaming on a Mister, threw some daisy-chained G-comp switches into a CRT, and was concerned of what the issue might have been. Now, I hear pops all the time when turning on all CRTs, but I assume that that's not what you meant, and you said gameplay was uninterrupted, so I guess that means your console didn't reset, or the Mister didn't reset, your TV didn't turn off and back on. So my gut's telling me it's the CRT, and it's probably not something to worry about. But I would still just be cautious. I would do the shake test for everything that's not a CRT. Make sure a washer didn't fall into a component and accidentally short two pieces together when it got just close enough. And, you know, I don't think you mentioned the CRT, but if you have the ability to even shine a flashlight in and make sure it doesn't look crazy, there isn't a ton of dust gunked inside or anything like that, or worse, spider's nests or anything like that, you know, anything that could really cause a short or some kind of static electricity buildup. And, you know, as long as you're very, very, very careful, taking a CRT outside, opening the back, and then hitting it with compressed air, you know, just take the back a little bit off, or in the case of a PVM or BVM, just take the top off or something like that and hit it with compressed air that way. So just don't get your hand anywhere near it. That should be totally safe. So I would assume that it's the CRT, and if your play session wasn't interrupted, it's totally fine. I have vague memories of hearing CRT pops all the time as a kid, and I think even sometimes I remember going up and like getting near the screen and having a static electricity, you know, zap me through the screen like that. So I think you should be okay. I don't think you need to run out and get an oscilloscope or anything like that, especially because you're using component video, so you don't really have to worry about the voltage issue. I guess I would just kind of do a visual inspection, see if everything's cool, and go from there. Eric Fortemeyer says they're looking for a good SCART cable for their Mister for use on a Sony PVM 2030. So I have two answers for you. To directly answer your question, any VGA to SCART cable that passes through the RGB pins and then taps pin 13 H-sync on the VGA side with a resistor on it to drop the voltage down to 75 ohm C-sync levels on the sync line is all you really need. And of course, you know, and a way to interface audio in as well. But from a video point of view, that's all you would need, and you should be compatible and compliant with any SCART equipment. However, if you're specifically talking about just going from the Mister to a PVM, you should be able, and please double check service manuals, regular manuals, whatever on your PVM, but you should be able to just get a VGA to BNC cable and plug it directly in that way. You'll be sending TTL level voltage, but a lot of PVMs handle that absolutely no problem. So basically, if you're going through SCART equipment of any kind, you really got to be making sure that the voltages are SCART level. But if you're going directly into a PVM, there's a much wider range of tolerance on all the lines. And it's not going to do damage because it was designed to accept those, whereas SCART equipment was definitely not designed to accept those. So I guess I would just kind of pick either one of those and see where you go from there. Lily Larceny had a very good question that every time I try to answer it, I end up going off on a long, angry rant about fanboys. So I'm going to try to just answer your question this time without adding any of my comments or emotion in it, which is hard for me because I'm a big mouth. But Lily's question was basically, Porkchop Express, who runs MrAddons.com, has a spreadsheet that measures controller latency. And Lily just wanted to confirm that that is a spreadsheet that measures the latency of controllers, not the latency of Mr. Now, I do actually understand why there might be that question from legitimate question askers like Lily, because Pork does run MrAddons.com, so it's not a stretch to wonder where that's coming from. But nope, that's just a measurement of the controllers. Now, with every scientific measurement that's ever been taken in any part of science, there's always some kind of tolerance swing. There's always the chance of something's off a little bit, but we're talking about milliseconds here. So if you have a controller that Pork lists as, hey, here's the minimum reading that I've gotten, here's the longest maximum reading, and here's the average, and you're talking about something that's like 2 or 3 milliseconds, it doesn't really matter if it's off a millisecond or not. It's still totally fine to use. And on the flip side, if you have a controller on that sheet that's got like, 25 milliseconds of lag, that's a laggy controller. There's no swing that could be off. There's no bad measurement. So without going into why the confusion behind this upsets me, once again, Lily, not because of you, just because I know what you're talking about here. That's just, everybody keep that in your minds, as that is a controller measurement, not anything else. Photosphene wants to know, if you're going to play on a CRT but capture to a PC, what kind of splitter would work? I guess you need to split both the analog audio and video before it goes into the TV and converter to HDMI, but I heard you talk about before that splitting analog video is not a good idea. So how do people do this? Well, there's a few answers to your question. The first is that, as a general rule in gaming, you could use a Y cable on audio, but never ever on video. And if you go to RetroRGB.com/oscilloscope, there's videos that explain exactly why. The audio video is probably the one to watch that explains why it's safe to do that with audio. You just get a audio volume drop when you do that. But generally speaking, there's 2 ways to go about doing what you want. Depending on the console, some consoles could safely output multiple different signals. So if you have the ability to buy special cables or make your own or anything like that, you could totally do something like put composite video into your CRT and RGB out to an HDMI converter, and then use a Y cable for your audio. But generally speaking, what you're probably looking to do is use some kind of, I'm going to use the term distribution amp just because I think it's the easiest to visualize, but you're going to want some kind of device where signals go in, it gets processed and split to many other signals. The G switches are my favorites in retro gaming, G comp switch and G SCART switch. The G comp could also do composite video as well, and those have 2 simultaneous outputs that are safe to use. Same thing with the G SCART switch, and you could do composite over SCART, but that's a cabling thing. So if you're not really sure about that, I don't want to overcomplicate. You could also use Extron crosspoints, or you could even try to just use basic splitters, which are getting more available depending on what you need them for. And even with things like component video and composite video, you could find used equipment on eBay that used to be pretty expensive, but now is sold at a fraction of the price that would work. I generally like to stick with stuff built by gamers for gamers type of thing. So as long as your budget allows, I would recommend the G stuff. But that's pretty much it. So just make sure that you're absolutely using some kind of distribution amp for video. It's better to do it for audio, so you don't have to worry about levels or anything like that. But if you absolutely needed to, you can Y cable audio, you cannot video. And there's absolutely misinformation about this all over the place. So please check out the oscilloscope page if you want proof with measurements and info on how to prove this yourself if you would like to. Watermelon Bonsai wanted to follow up from last week about the PVM 2030. Apparently, it does not have any means to fix its geometry other than opening it up and messing with the innards. And that's actually what I heard after the Q&A as well. You have to pop the back open, and the pots are available, but you're still working inside a CRT. So Watermelon Bonsai said it's still not something that they're comfortable ever doing on their own, and I don't blame you one bit. That's totally understandable, and it's one of these things where if you ever felt like it, you could take the steps to do it safely. But if you have another solution, absolutely, why bother then? And speaking of another solution, it looks like they received their picture adjust box from Time Harvest, and so far it's been working perfectly. Nice and easy to fix the picture. So there you go. I mean, why mess with it when that has a perfectly good solution that, as far as I tested, seems completely safe to use with your monitor. Also, thank you very much, Watermelon Bonsai, for all the kind words. It's really nice of you. I very much appreciate it. And I'm glad that your picture is able to be easily centered now. Dave Eli said they have a Mr. issue and they're wondering if I've seen it before. In some games, horizontal scrolling is quite blurry when connected to a CRT. It almost looks like the scrolling portion of the screen is doubled. The CRT they're using is a PVM 14M2U. The Mr. INI is all defaults except YPBPR being set to 1. So that right there is a hint for one thing, but I'm going to continue with your question. So you're saying Wonder Boy 3 on the SMS is one of the games that has the problem, but other SMS games like Shinobi don't have the problem at all. On Neo Geo, Metal Slug X shows the issue, while Blues Journey doesn't. Been trying to get feedback from others about this, but haven't heard back yet. Would like to know if you've seen or heard this issue before, and whether there's a way to resolve the issue. So I could tell you my experience. I have not heard or seen anything like your second paragraph about the individual games. But on the first half of things, I have a consumer-grade JVC TV that's awesome. It's recapped. It looks great. It looks amazing when I have my HD Retrovision cables plugged into the component video input. And I had been using it with my Mister and couldn't figure out why Mister looked so crappy on it. Because I'm going, this thing looks so good with HD Retrovision cables, and I'm using shielded VGA to component cables, right? Yeah, didn't take my own advice. Finally, I got fed up with it and cut the cables, which I know I hate wasting stuff, but I'm glad I did, because I cut the cables open and they weren't shielded. It was all foam. There was no metal shielding around it whatsoever. So I think I bought like 3 others. They were pretty cheap. The first one I plugged in looked good, so I didn't bother cutting it because, don't look a gift horse in the mouth. And that solved my problem altogether. So if you were saying all games looked blurry, I would say definitely check your VGA to component cable, try different adapters, try getting one made, making your own, whatever you want to do with that. But because that you're saying it's different games, I don't really know where to go with that. It could still be the cable, and it could just be the reason that you're seeing blur or any kind of distortion on one game and another is because the colors are blending together. Like Wonder Boy you mentioned, I think that's if I'm remembering that one, that's a very blue heavy game, while other games, might not be, and blue is a color that you always see a lot of interference in with these retro gaming things. I'm kind of oversimplifying everything here just to put it into perspective, but basically, if you know that your cable is good, I would go to the Mr. Discord and ask. Maybe anybody else has stumbled across it. Maybe there's something else that's going on. Maybe it's a converter. If you're using an HDMI converter to get to component video, that could be part of the issue. But if it's not cabling related, essentially, then I really wouldn't know where to go. But I did want to at least share my story about my component video out of Mr. experience, because I thought I did everything right, but I was just using what I didn't realize were bad cables. And once I swapped the cable out, it was perfect. It looked just like original consoles with HD Retrovisions. So hopefully I pointed you in the right direction with that one. Jason Guffey has a bunch of questions, and I'm just going to skip to the answers in respect of time. But just to make it clear, I don't ever mind long questions. I just feel like it's best for everybody listening to just skip to the end. But if anybody disagrees, please let me know. I really just want to do what all of you would like. But to answer Jason's questions, first, I guess Jason enjoyed the CDI stream. F the haters that Robe really brings out your chest hair. I'm going to have the Terminator theme stuck in my head for days. That really was one of the most fun things I've done in a long time. And believe it or not, I hate to jinx myself, but there weren't any haters. Everybody seemed to have a really good time and got the joke, as well as got what wasn't a joke. I really did enjoy playing the CDI, but I loved joking around with my friend. So yeah, I don't know. I think that was one of the coolest streams I've ever done. And definitely the Terminator theme song, that whole thing was awesome. Writing that, recording it with Ronnie and Kendall, having it mixed by Mark, having my musician friends tease me that the guitar sounds more like me than on the sound we used in the actual album I'm in. It was awesome. It was fun. It was great. And I got to basically play the Terminator to my own version of the theme song. One of the coolest things I've ever done. But anyway, on to your actual questions. About the OSSC, you want to know if line doubling or line multiplying, like what the OSSC does, is comparable in a way to integer scaling. it's the same. It's exactly the same in that the OSSC is taking the incoming image and either doubling, tripling, quadrupling, quintupling. Is that right? And it's not doing anything other than making an exact copy each way up, which is why it stays so sharp. And that is actually nearest neighbor scaling. So it is one and the same. There might be a little nitpicks. I'm sure there's always a much smarter person than me listening that's going to explain exactly why it's not quite the same. But when you're talking about discussing scaling options, you could easily visualize that as the same because it's the same sharp outcome. Also, you said even some scalers, even those built into TVs, will add black borders to an image and factor that in as part of a scaling, like letterboxing. Is this common, and does it ever turn out any good? And is aspect ratio typically preserved? So the only time I've run into that a lot in retro gaming is when you have something like a Super Nintendo's resolution that's not, actually most old consoles' resolution isn't actually 240 pixels high. So the TV will kind of frame it as if it was, and that's why you get borders on the top and bottom as well. Some TVs just process the signal wrong, but does it turn out any good is absolutely a subjective question. Because for me personally, that's why I love 5x scaling in almost every single scenario, including the scenarios in which sometimes you have a little cutoff on the top and bottom. In those cases, I still would prefer that than seeing any border, because not only do you fill the screen, but you also get more width to the screen without stretching it abnormally. Your picture is the same width that it should. You don't have Fat Mario and Fat Sonic. Everything is the same as it should be, but it fills up more of a flat panel screen. Also, with CRT monitors, if CRT monitors zoom or stretch, does that increase the lag at all? So I think the way that CRTs do this, and I can't speak for all of them, but I think the settings on a CRT, like overscan and underscan, adjusting geometry and stuff like that, isn't quite a zoom like it would be on a flat panel. You're not taking an image that's processed and reprocessing it. I think it's just kind of stretching it past where the draw distance is. I could be wrong about that one, and I haven't really looked into it. I'm just kind of visualizing it as, hey, there's a VGA monitor with H&V size controls on the front. I stretch them wider and taller than the picture is, so essentially zoom it. No, that would not add lag, but you never know. There could be a CRT, especially if it's something like a 1080p CRT. I don't think they had any, but 1080i CRT could actually have the same type of processor that you would see in a flat panel, and in that case, it would add lag. But I mean, it would probably be the same lag with or without the scaling, because you're adding a frame buffer to go into that HD CRT. So basically, if you're using an old computer monitor that has the stretch knobs on the front, I would not ever expect that to add lag. Any kind of HD CRT, you could pretty much expect it. There are definitely models that don't have it, but I've seen more that do than don't. Lastly, their OSSC is fried, and hypothetically, if there was an advanced version, would it be coming out soonish? Marcus is very open, posts about the OSSC Pro on Shmups all the time. I don't think it's coming out soon, but maybe wait a little bit just to see. I know there was some progress, and I would picture, or I would expect that more info on when it's coming will be out soon. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it'll be out soon. It just means that you might get a better idea, within a few weeks or a month or two. So if it's something that you have another way to play these games, and the OSSC is a streaming solution or a secondary way of playing it, I would hold off. If it's the only way that you play it, yeah, just buy another one or something, because not playing your games is worse. Is way worse than waiting. On the other side of things too, if you really were waiting for the Pro, but you want something to hold you off, but you don't want to just buy the same thing, consider a GBS control, because it's one of these devices that even when the OSSC Pro comes out and it has all these crazy features, you'd still be able to use the GBSC as a tool in your toolbox for a million other things, and it does a great job. So it would totally replace your OSSC temporarily. I think the OSSC is a little sharper and a little cleaner because everything stays in the digital realm. It's not analog to digital to analog to digital, but the GBSC is awesome, and you will not stop using it when the OSSC Pro comes out. You'll just use it for different stuff. So hopefully that answers all of it. I think I nailed it all in one shot, but I'm sorry if I got something wrong. Please feel free to re-ask, and I'll get back to it soon. Daniel Lodato has a really good question that's stumped me. I've tried to answer this a few times, and every time I think about it, I kind of put it into a different perspective in my head. So I'm going to try my best, Daniel, and hopefully my ramblings will point you in the right direction. But Daniel has a Tower of Power setup. So a 32X, a Model 2 Genesis, and a Model 2 Sega CD, or maybe Mega CD. Same thing, basically. They also have one of the older EverDrives before they changed to the X series naming, and everything's great. Everything works perfect. But it seems like they were considering upgrading to an optical drive emulator version of one of the ROM carts, either the Mega SD or the Mega EverDrive Pro. And they already picked up an MSD EXP because space is limited, but that would mean that it would have to get a Mega SD and not the Mega EverDrive Pro. So I guess the question is which ROM cart to get. And my recommendation is based on a couple of things. You mentioned space is limited, you mentioned the Tower of Power, and you already purchased the MSD EXP. So I think that because you're saying these things, you would be okay with removing your Sega CD2 and, putting it away for now. And in that case, I would get the Mega SD and use the MSD EXP. And that way you could have all optical drives run from that. You could take it out and throw it in top whenever you want actual ROMs. Or I guess if you really wanted to, you could keep your other EverDrive and swap them back and forth. But because of the setup that you have now, that's my recommendation. If you wanted to keep all original hardware working, I might actually suggest picking up a second Genesis, because you could still get them reasonably priced depending on where you live, and depending on, game stores, shipping, all that stuff. But it seems like because you said space is limited, that's not really an option. So I think, based on the info you've given me, and based on the fact that you already have an MSD EXP coming, I would pick up the Mega SD and use it that way. So basically replace the Sega CD with the MSD EXP, and now you could save some space, run all your discs from there, and then whenever you want the original experience of using the discs, you could always just plug your Model 2 Sega CD back in. So I think that's what I'm going with now. Hopefully I won't go back and re-record this later on or something, but I think maybe if that's not a good recommendation, it might add a little bit of perspective so you could decide for yourself on what might be better than that, but I think that's what I'm going with in this one. Jordan Chaston said, because of their job, they found themselves playing handhelds a lot lately, but when they're home, they prefer to play on their consoles. Because of this, they really love using their Nomad, so I can continue where I left off, switching between it and their Genesis. Anyway, I wanted to do the same with the SNES, so after a lot of research, I bought a Superboy, and despite its flaws, it seems to be the best portable SNES for sale, as it's a clone and not emulation. Sorry. My big issue is screen quality. So my question is this. It's trivial to mod the Superboy to get RGBS. Many people have done it and run it to a mini DIN for console-style play, but I was wondering if I could use this RGBS and wire it to an RGB DRV board with a 3.5-inch IPS screen. Should the RGB driver just work by feeding it power and an RGBS signal? It would be amazing if it does. I could then try to design a 3D printed mount and see if I could pay someone to make a replacement glass lens, since the original setup uses a 16:9 screen. I think all of that's possible. The only thing that I would recommend is see if you could make sure the exact voltage that the RGB DRV is expecting. Is it actually expecting true RGBS the same way a SCART device would? But other than that, it should be a decent solution. And I know a few people with the Superboy, and it's essentially just like a SNES clone with a composite video output. So it's not bad, but it's not great either. But in the context that you're describing it, that seems like a great solution. So yeah, I think all of that stuff is doable. I would just want to make sure that you shape the signal coming out of that and going into the RGB driver that exactly to the way it's supposed to be shaped. Rob F228 had some questions, and I am going to be completely useless to you, my friend. I am so sorry. First, they're looking to purchase an Atari computer with a Sophia chip that outputs a DVI signal, and they want to know if it's going to work on a monitor or TV with only HDMI input. So I think all that you would need is just a basic DVI to HDMI cable. I have them linked right in the Amazon store for the ones that I use. They work great. However, depending on the way that outputs DVI, there's a chance you might not get audio, and there's a chance your monitor might not accept it at all. I think you'll be fine, but I've never tested a Sophia. I actually had a board, and then I never ended up installing it because I had to sell a bunch of stuff, and that went with it. But I don't want to, or at the very least, want to be open and honest about the advice I give. I don't want to tell you, yes, this will work. But the good news is you could buy a $8 cable, and while I don't ever like to waste anything, if you lose $8 and you have a cable in your drawer in case you ever need it, that's not the worst thing that could happen. But I think all you need is a cable. But if you really want to double check out the threads on Atari Age. There's a whole bunch of people that use these and really love them. The other two things I wanted to mention, also, Rob posted this in the wrong spot, but I just happened to find where it was based on where it was. So not teasing you or anything, Rob, but just make sure that anybody who wants to post a question, please post in the latest Q&A post, not just like the top post wherever you support. Actually go to last week, or in this case this week's Q&A, and post your question there. And the only reason I was able to find this is just because I skimmed past it while looking for something else. So I'll be deleting this, Rob, not because I want to delete your question, but just because I want to make sure it's a visual example. People keep everything in the right spot. And Rob had one other question about customer service that for a company that I'm not a part of, so I just can't answer. And I once again, I'm not at all trying to throw shade. It's just, it is what it is. I have no interaction with another company, so I could only give you answers based on me and the stuff I'm involved with. So sorry that I'm so useless to you this week, Rob, but hopefully I'll do better the next time you have a question. Well, that's it for this week. Hopefully all the videos popping up one day right after another is okay with everybody, and I'm not bombarding people with too much content or anything like that. I just wanted to keep to the existing schedule while also being able to do all the other awesome stuff I get to be a part of. So anyway, thank you so much to everybody that participates, and of course, thank you to everybody that supports in any way at all, because you are the reason that all of these videos, the behind the scenes work, the weekly podcast, and everything else keeps going. So thank you all very much, and I'll see you next week.